Hi everyone, I'm Todd Gillens, and I'm speaking to you today from the land of the Chochenyo people, which is the east side of San Francisco Bay. I have no formal typography training, and so I'm really pleased to be part of the conference today. I'll be speaking about an artwork that has swept me into the world of letterforms. And I've got 15 minutes, so let's get started. Um, the project began as I was noticing curbs and considering how they are a space of communication. It's both fascinating and really kind of dull. They're ubiquitous in cities. There's lots of different fonts and a kind of a narrow range of color coding. And I started to wonder what might be communicated if a curve could become really a space of public wonder and reflection. There are linear spaces, which lines up with writing in that way, but the, they require the body gets involved if the messages stretch over any length of space. Occasionally you see some obscure signs or mysterious markings on curbs. These are pointing toward utility covers, which could be underwater if the street is flooded. And you also sometimes see indications of the larger landscape in which of which the curbs are a part of the system. Curbs are also modifying the landscape, especially the flow of water, and create these small kind of local ecologies that are improvised in different ways. Growing of plants is probably the most common one. And once in a while, there's a convergence, like here in San Francisco, where the streets are stamped, the name of the street is stamped on the street corner, and you can actually stand on California Street and you're on and in California. It names the place where you are. So a curb structurally is simply the heavier pieces at the edges that keep the streets from squishing out from the pressure of transport. And of course, roads are pathways for commerce and conquest. And I'm sure I'm not the first to suggest a parallel between roadways and printing, which also increases the speed of, in that case, of reading and the distribution of information. Without a curb, water begins to take back the dynamics of the land. As roadways shed water, the water undermines the roadway itself. So there's this interesting convergence of natural processes and human processes pushing back and forth. And it's a complicated interaction. If we look at this map of southern part of San Francisco, the historic creeks are in green lines as they wiggle through the landscape. And the underground pipes where water is now hidden are the brown dots that run underneath the streets. So water was the original scribe of the landscape, and I began to see the curb as this pivot with natural processes on one side and human processes on the other. But water was now missing from that from the surface, and I wanted to bring it back through the project. So I first needed to know how water actually works when it's in the landscape on its own. And I spent 3 summers in the Sierra working with David Herbst and other stream ecologists, surveying streams. We would go up and down a 150-meter stretch of stream, taking measurements, measuring the stones, the width of the stream, taking biological samples. This is one of 3 pages from each stretch of stream that we would collect. And it's essentially a kind of number portrait of a stream reach. I think it's kind of like something we do when we transpose speech into writing, taking something that's mobile and making it static. And so what science is doing is making a bridge between confidence in knowledge and the vitality of changing processes. At one of the field stations, we worked at this array of adjustable streams allows researchers to compare different flow regimes. And so I knew something about my subject, but I needed a font to express it. And cursive was an obvious choice. It has a flow, and it exists at a kind of midpoint between the ephemerality and the uniqueness of speech and the anonymity and sort of standardization of printed words. I had the wonderful opportunity of going to Digital Arts Studios in Belfast in their international residency program. Belfast is a city founded around water and developed around the mills that were textile mills that were powered by the streams that came into the main river flowing through Belfast. An aerial view of a part of land near Belfast showing the conversation between tides and rivers, human settlement and transportation. And this kind of dialogue would go on even at the smallest scale, where the patterns of the sand would reappear in the plaza stones as fossilized patterns. So I was guided in my work there by two books. One was Norge's The Stroke, Theory of Writing, which looked at really the anatomy of how letters are written. And Tamara Plakins Thornton's Handwriting in America, A Cultural History of Handwriting Conventions and Pedagogy. So these kind of set up the context for thinking about letters, but I needed material. What I wanted to do was find a historical reference to the place, someone whose handwriting had actually been infused with that landscape. I worked mostly at the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland, which is a marvelous archive, one of several in Belfast. And what I found was at first it was very difficult to find things because they're not cataloged by handwriting isn't a search term. And so it took me a while to find something to work with, and I along the way found a lot of impressive handwriting. But I wanted something that was unique expression of an individual character rather than a standard font. And I found a few wonderful things that I worked with. One was W.R. Rogers, who was a Presbyterian minister and a BBC commentator, and a poet who died in Los Angeles, which is where I was born. And Florence Patterson, who was the first licensed Northern Irish woman architect. And in these letters, she's writing of her childhood meeting with Roger Casement. She's writing about that meeting to a biographer of Casement. So I found that I needed about 10 pages of material to get a proper alphabet, or most of the alphabet, including the capital letters. And I worked on Photoshop, plucking the letters out of the flow of text. In these pages from Roger's notebooks, I gathered the alphabet so I could see what I had and what I was missing. This is the distribution of letters from that page. So it doesn't take much to get most of the letters, but then there's a few letters that are actually pretty rare. I would groom the images of the letters, trim them just so. Sometimes I would need to draw them out to figure out where the energy of the mark was going and um, how the mark turned through its arcs, and how to bring that kind of energy into the digital image. And there were some things like in Roger's writing where he would use a different S if it was the beginning of the word, or if the S was embedded within the word or at the end. So I needed some alternate letters. I worked with a online service. It was free service, Fonts 101, which was very simple. It's just a template, and you fill in each square and then upload it, and a few minutes later you have a font file and you can type away in someone else's handwriting. But it took 8 or 10 iterations of printing the font out to make sure that the letters were actually working and the pieces weren't dropping out and there weren't awkward corners. I would also make comparisons, like in this one, my font is at the top and Roger's hand is diagonally below that. And it was helpful also to keep the letters, which might be workable and beautiful, but to keep them in context and to see, do they still have the same kind of vitality, the same character? Does the character have character? This was my working space at Digital Art Studio. And so while I was there, I was able to produce some prints. These are about 1 meter long with the fonts that I had made. This is Florence Patterson's font and some of my reflections on being at the archive, and a fragment of language of my thoughts on the landscape around Belfast in the hand of W.R. Rogers. I was aiming with these at the boundary, like finding where is the balance between reading and looking, where the font and the words are carrying meaning equally. And once things are in a digital form, you can, so many possibilities open up. This is a notebook-sized paper where the writing is about 1 millimeter high. And the residency was partially crowdfunded as well. So I was writing postcards to my funders in the fonts that I had created. Back in the United States, I started to design a project for Reno, Nevada, of a text that would be about 1 mile long and would follow the water as it moved along the Truckee River through Reno. Was doing some experiments with materials, how I might move the writing from, put it onto the curb. And this is traffic striping tape with a computer-driven cutter. Some students from the University of Nevada Fine Arts program helped me to install it as part of the installation, and a piece of the sentence. It had a wonderful reflective quality about it. And so then I went to the archives in the Reno area looking for handwriting that I would use for that project of someone whose life intersected the landscape of the Reno area in some interesting and not very well-known way. And I landed on Claude Dukes, who managed the water systems for that area until 1984, until his death. And here's my font on the bottom compared to his original on the top. So that test was taken up, and it wore well, but it left a glue residue. And so this fall I'll be putting a new test of a couple different materials down. And hopefully if that works, then the project will move forward. So thank you very much for your attention, and I really look forward to hearing your comments and responses.